Welcome back, Darklings, to the charnel ground of memory, where even the sweetest lullabies have blood on their lips. We carry these verses from the cradle, their simple cadence a part of our own architecture. But what if one of the most playful, most nonsensical of these rhymes is not a fantasy at all? What if it is a spectral echo from a locked room, a coded message preserving a story of terror, faith, and martyrdom? You know the words. They feel like nonsense, a charming jumble of images. Goosey, goosey gander, whither shall I wander? Upstairs and downstairs, and in my lady's chamber. There I met an old man who wouldn't say his prayers, so I took him by his left leg and threw him down the stairs. Beneath this jaunty surface, however, many believe lies the harrowing tale of a hunted priest, forcibly torn from his secret sanctuary and condemned to a gruesome fate. This interpretation drags us back to the violent religious upheaval of 16th century England, a time when a king's desire reshaped a nation's soul. King Henry VIII, desperate for a male ere his wife, Catherine of Aragon, could not provide, sought an annulment from the Pope. When Rome refused, Henry took a truly seismic step. In an act of supreme ego and political will, he severed 1,000 years of history, breaking with the Catholic Church to establish his own Church of England, with himself as its head. This was not a gentle parting of ways. It was a brutal amputation. The dissolution of the monasteries saw ancient abbeys torn down, their wealth seized by the crown, their sacred relics desecrated. To be a practicing Catholic was no longer just a matter of conscience. It was an act of treason. In this terrifying new landscape, the rhyme's imagery sharpens into focus. The old man who wouldn't say his prayers becomes a Catholic priest, steadfastly refusing to renounce the Latin Mass for the New English Book of Common Prayer. The line, "I took him by his left leg," is thought to be a chillingly direct reference to the derogatory slang term for Catholics. Left-footers, and the final, violent act of throwing him down the stairs serves as a grim metaphor for capture, torture, and a brutal execution. With the kingdom fractured and a new faith enforced by law, the simple act of private worship became a capital crime, forcing believers to devise desperate and ingenious methods of concealment. The fear that Henry ignited became a wildfire under his daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, after a series of Catholic plots to assassinate her and install her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. The crown's paranoia curdled into brutal policy. Merely being a Catholic priest on English soil was now an automatic act of high treason. To hunt these men, the state employed a network of pursuivants, priest hunters, men driven by the twin engines of religious fanaticism and the promise of lucrative rewards. They would descend on the country estates of the Catholic gentry without warning, their arrival a sudden, unpredictable terror. In response, these noble families turned their homes into fortresses of faith, their very architecture contorted to conceal the forbidden. This was the era of the priest hole, an ingenious and desperate invention. Secret chambers were engineered behind fireplaces, beneath floorboards, and inside false walls, their entrances disguised as everyday features. The master of this craft was a Jesuit lay brother named Nicholas Owen, a tiny man nicknamed Little John, whose genius for concealment saved hundreds of lives. He was an architect of shadows, a saint-maker who burrowed salvation into the bones of a house. But his work was perilous. Owen himself was eventually caught, tortured mercilessly without betraying his secrets, and died on the rack. His fate was a reminder of the price of discovery. To be sealed inside one of his creations was to be buried alive. Imagine the crushing darkness, the air thick and stale, your legs cramping in a space too small to stand. Your only connection to the world is the sound filtering through the walls. The heavy tread of boots, the splintering of wood, the methodical, terrifying search that wanders, just as the rhyme says, upstairs and downstairs and in my lady's chamber, violating the most private sanctums of the home. The hunt could last for days, and if the homeowners were arrested, a priest hole could become a permanent tomb. There are tragic accounts of priests succumbing to starvation or suffocation, their hiding place becoming their grave. In the 1940s, during the renovation of a 16th century home, a long-forgotten priest hole was supposedly uncovered, and with it, the skeletal remains of its last occupant. For those discovered and captured alive, the end was even more horrific. They faced the ultimate punishment for treason, to be hung until barely conscious, cut down, disemboweled, and finally, beheaded and carved into 4 pieces. Yet, for all its haunting parallels, the paper trail of the rhyme itself tells a different story, suggesting that this perfect allegory of persecution might be a ghost assembled from the bones of other verses. The most compelling stories are not always the truest. When we turn from folklore to forensics, from whispered legends to the printed page, the case for the hunted priest begins to fracture. The first time Goosey Gander is known to have appeared in print was in a 1784 collection called Gammer Gurton's Garland. But the version it contains is strikingly different. It is missing the crucial, violent conclusion. Instead of finding a defiant old man, the wandering gander finds a cup of sack and a race of ginger. Sack, you should know, was a fortified white wine from Spain, and a race simply meant a root or slice. The rhyme we know today, with its grim finale, doesn't appear for at least another decade. In that gap, it seems our gander became tangled in the threads of other stories. Before the 19th century standardized these verses into the forms we now recognize, nursery rhymes were part of a fluid and ruthless oral tradition. They were living things, mutating, merging, and borrowing limbs from one another as they were passed down through generations or sold for pennies on printed chapbooks. Goosey Gander appears to have undergone just such a transformation, becoming a patchwork of cruelty by absorbing 2 other popular rhymes of the era. The first was a verse of casual brutality chanted by schoolchildren. It was called Old Father Longlegs, and it was recited while capturing and torturing crane flies. The lines are shockingly familiar. Old Father Longlegs can't say his prayers. Take him by the left leg and throw him downstairs. The second contribution came from a comical, almost slapstick rhyme known as The Parson in the Pulpit, which depicted a clumsy clergyman who gabbled and he gabbled till he tumbled downstairs. The stairs gave a crack, and he broke his old back. It seems our rhyme's violent conclusion was stitched together from the cruelty of the schoolyard and the comedy of the pulpit. This doesn't entirely erase the darkness. It simply shows how a cultural preoccupation with punishing those who can't say their prayers, be it an insect or a bumbling cleric, found a new home in an existing verse. But here is the crucial clue. That original mention of sack, wine, acts as a linguistic fossil. Its popularity peaked in the 16th and 17th centuries, the very height of the religious persecutions. So while the rhyme's violent ending may be a later addition, its origins do indeed lie in that turbulent era. This earlier mention of wine and spice, however, points us toward a completely different kind of shadow, one lurking not in a hidden chapel, but in the raucous taverns and back alleys of Shakespearean London. To understand this other rhyme, this secret history, we must shed our modern ears and learn to hear the words as they were spoken in the boisterous, profane, and witty world of Elizabethan England. In the slang of the 16th and 17th centuries, the word goose was not merely a bird. It was a common and often derogatory term for a prostitute. To be bitten by a Winchester goose was a euphemism we will return to, one with grim consequences. Likewise, a gander was not just a male goose. It referred to a married man carousing while his wife was confined after childbirth, and by extension, any man out on the town looking for illicit fun. To go gandering was to wander foolishly, often in search of female company. Suddenly the rhyme's opening lines transform. Goosey gander, whither shall I wander? Is no longer a child's idle question. It is the prowling call of a libertine, a man asking himself where he might find a goose for the night. The journey upstairs and downstairs ceases to be a search for a hidden priest and becomes a tour of a brothel's many rooms, or a series of amorous escapades in different chambers. This reading is powerfully reinforced by the contents of that original 1784 verse, the cup of sack and the race of ginger. For centuries, ginger has been held as a potent aphrodisiac, a spice believed to stir the blood and heighten desire. Sack, the strong wine beloved by Shakespeare's Falstaff, was the social lubricant of the age. The two together are not the makings of a nursery story. They are the ingredients for a night of planned seduction. The rhyme, seen through this lens, becomes a kind of bawdy tavern song, the sort of thing that would be printed on a cheap broadside ballad and sold on a London street corner for a penny. Its double meanings intended for the amusement of gentlemen. And the destination, in my lady's chamber, becomes the most transgressive line of all. This could refer to the ultimate conquest for a philanderer, the private bedroom of a respectable married woman. Or it could be a cynical euphemism for a room in a high-class brothel, where one might find the lady of the house. In either case, the verse sings of crossing moral boundaries. But this game of vice and revelry has a deeply tragic and sinister underside, one whose legacy is etched into the very soil of London and gives the rhyme its most disturbing potential meaning. That dark underside has a name: the Winchester geese. From the 12th century until the 17th, the brothels in the London borough of Southwark were not just tolerated. They were licensed and taxed by one of the most powerful figures in the land, the Bishop of Winchester. The women who worked in these establishments, trapped by poverty and circumstance, were known cynically as the Winchester geese. They lived under the bishop's authority, yet because of their profession, the church denied them a Christian burial. When they died, their bodies were taken to a patch of unconsecrated ground, a potter's field for the city's outcasts. Today, this place is known as the Crossbones Graveyard. For centuries a forgotten dump, it has been transformed into a heartbreakingly beautiful community garden, its gates adorned with ribbons and poems, a shrine to the thousands of outcast dead buried there. This brings us to the rhyme's most chilling piece of slang. In the 1500s, the phrase "bitten by a goose" was a common euphemism for contracting a venereal disease. It was the shadow that stalked the brothels, a frequent and often fatal consequence of the gander's game. When we see the rhyme through this final, grim filter, an entirely new and devastating narrative emerges. A man, the gander, wanders in search of a prostitute, a goose. He finds one and is metaphorically bitten, infected with a disease. He then carries this contagion home with him, taking it upstairs and downstairs, and ultimately in my lady's chamber, where he passes his affliction to his unsuspecting wife. The rhyme becomes a bleak, cautionary tale of infidelity, contagion, and betrayal. Even the cup of sack and race of ginger can be reinterpreted not as aphrodisiacs, but as a desperate folk remedy, a useless charm against the sickness that now courses through his veins. Of course, there is one last, simpler possibility. By the late 17th century, gander was also recorded as slang for simply wandering foolishly. Perhaps the rhyme is nothing more than a light-hearted song about a drunkard stumbling home and tumbling down the stairs. But it's hard to shake the feeling that the echoes of something far darker are caught within its cadence. Whether it is the ghost of a hunted priest or the tragedy of the Winchester geese, both interpretations transform the rhyme into a secret monument. They preserve the memory of those who were persecuted by the powerful, one for his faith, the others for their poverty and gender. The rhyme becomes a vessel for the trauma of the voiceless. So what do you think, Darklings? A tale of holy martyrdom or of profane sickness? Share your theories in the shadows below. And if your fascination for the darkness hidden in the nursery still lingers, join me next time as we dance with death and uncover the plague-ridden truth of Ring a Roses.